Fighting erupts between Palestinians and Israelis, and the U.S. tries to calm things down. Welcome to DC Bureau, the Wall Street Journal's online politics show. I'm Jerry Seib, and I'm joined today by my journal colleagues David Wessel, Julian Barnes, and a special guest, Tony Cordesman of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and one of the town's real experts on the Middle East, politics and security in the Middle East. Tony, let's talk about what's happening in the Gaza Strip. You know, it's fighting has erupted, rockets from Gaza into Israel, Israeli airstrikes into Gaza, and now the potential for a ground invasion by Israeli troops. You wrote about this all yesterday, and it was kind of depressing, actually, I have to say. You wrote that of the prospects going forward, that everything that's happening can lead to a degree of strategic paralysis that ensures no stable solution is possible. Why so depressing?
I don't know if it's depressing. Reality does tend to have a few problems as distinguished from either optimism or hope. But we need to really go back and how long have we been at this and watched Israel try to establish security, either in dealing on the West Bank or in Gaza or with Lebanon? It has had peace settlements in Egypt and with Jordan. Those now seem to be at least much more at risk than in the past. The whole issue of the Syrian border, which was secure for decades, is up for grabs. Yeah. And the fact is that what we have is a steady process, not of peace, but of Israel expanding, developing, creating a much larger eastern Jerusalem, larger settlement areas. We have a Gaza which, quite aside from all of its ideological and political polarization, is turning into a depressed economic slum with no way out, no hope, almost a giant prison camp. We have a West Bank which exists largely through outside aid and subsidies, but not through actual economic progress. You have massive unemployment for Arab youth, among even Israeli Arabs, but especially in Gaza and especially on the West Bank. And all of this creates tensions that extremists and outsiders can exploit within the Palestinian movement, and where Israel comes under more and more pressure to try to use force without really ever having a clear means that can enforce security over time.
Yeah, and it does seem those extremists may have started this whole process, because I mean, you've talked to people at the Pentagon this week. It's not clear that those first rockets that set off this escalation came from actual Hamas forces at all, but maybe from splinter Palestinian groups.
That's right. I mean, there's in this crisis, there's a range of groups that people are worried about: Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other smaller groups that are not under the direct control of Hamas. And that prospect is worrying to folks because, you know, can there be a negotiated settlement? Will it just break down quickly again?
So does the U.S. have any leverage here with either the Palestinians or the Israelis, or for that matter with the Egyptians?
I think it has leverage. Obviously, one has to be careful about leverage. That implies somehow you are pushing someone. What the U.S. really has is influence. There's always the tacit threat, of course, that you're not going to provide aid or you'll provide more support to the other side. But the fact is that these are critical battles, political and in security terms, for each of the factions involved, for the West Bankers, for the Gazans, and I think we almost have to make a clear distinction between these two Palestinian groups, for the Israelis. It is a massive test for the Egyptians and for the Muslim Brotherhood to try to find some way of striking a balance they can survive and also not becoming the de facto supporter of Gaza, which some Israelis are trying to push for.
So that's the environment that Secretary of State Clinton headed into this week, talking about an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but one in which the Palestinians we talked to, led by Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority over in the West Bank, have almost nothing to do with what's actually going on. And the interlocutor is not Hosni Mubarak in Cairo, but a Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt. I mean, that's a huge change strategically for the U.S. I mean, it's not at all clear how the U.S. maneuvers in that environment. I guess this is a test case.
It is a real chess case, and we need to remember it isn't just Israel. It is access to Egypt for basing, the Suez Canal, the whole deployment of U.S. forces that affect the Gulf. But it's also a test for Morsi. Can he find some kind of balance?
Yeah.
And at this point, what everybody is striving for is not really a solution, but a ceasefire. That at least would buy time. It would reduce the suffering. Whether it would really simply be any kind of solution seems doubtful. No matter what happens, there'll always be another way of putting long-range rockets into Gaza.
Yeah.
There'll always be another way of putting IEDs or attacks that can affect Israelis. They will always improve their intelligence and their targeting. And at some point, unfortunately, each ceasefire seems likely to simply be the pause before the next round.
So are the Iranians the actual suppliers of many of these rockets? Some of these rockets?
Many of these rockets. Some of these rockets are coming from Libya. That's the new stream that opened up after the fall of Gaddafi. But you know, Iran is the big player here, and they are. It's really cheap for them to supply these rockets through the Red Sea route through Egypt.
Yeah.
What about the politics inside Israel? How is that playing out now?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think, frankly, you find out really if Israel goes in on the ground. There's several
I mean,
sets
to find
of
out whether there's public support for the...
you find out how the politics develop, because however this starts, it's really what happens if you're in on the ground and everyone sees the impact. If it's a repetition of the last time, the ground invasion basically accomplished nothing other than increasing casualties. Most of what was done had been done earlier in the air phase. Very quickly they reached the point of diminishing returns. You were doing more and more to get less and less against a highly dispersed enemy, which basically can replace almost all of the people and structures and equipment within it. And that really comes down to the fact there are several sets of politics here. There are the election politics, with the election coming up.
In Israel.
There's the whole question of what each of these conflicts does in terms of this strange mixture of constantly changing political parties. And then there are the politics within the Israeli military, where there is an ongoing debate, much as there is in the United States. How do you reshape your forces? How do you actually deal with these problems on the ground? Because for virtually all modern forces, the question is how can conventional forces really win an asymmetric war where all the extremist has to do is constantly provoke an attack to sort of make political gains?
I'm curious, Jerry, if you think it's critical for the Obama administration, for Hillary Clinton to avoid a Israeli ground action. Is that their most important thing for them to do?
You know, I'm not sure that's the most important thing. I think they would like to, because once you know, it's easier to get in than to get out in any military situation. But as you pointed out, so if your goal is a ceasefire, ceasefires are not very stable in this kind of an environment. They tend not to last. So I think you have to avoid a ground incursion if you can. But you have to start working on something that nobody's even mentioned in this conversation, which is the peace process. That's what really seems to separate this crisis from past ones. To me, nobody even pretends there's an Israeli-Palestinian peace process now, or any immediate prospect of one, and that's probably got to turn around here.
But I think, you know, that's easy to say. I frankly don't believe that at this point you have any levers. First, we're right in the middle of an unresolved crisis. Second, for at least several years, what have we seen? In Israel, it becomes more and more distant from what they see as a non-partner, a Palestinian movement divided, almost to the point now where, as you touched on earlier, Hamas, which was once the extremist group, now seems to be increasingly levered in Gaza by much more extreme, polarized groups that are willing to take more risks. And you mentioned Abbas, but looking at what little we know of public opinion polls, the fact is that it's very unlikely that the Palestinian Authority could actually win an election on the West Bank at this point.
Was it a mistake to block Abbas's UN moves, and did that weaken him? Should the administration have done more to
You mean
strengthen him?
let's have a vote in the UN to declare
Yeah,
a Palestinian
correct, yeah.
state? I don't think that politically the administration had much choice in that. So.